Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for clinicians in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medical legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. And today we're doing a second podcast on the personal impact of patient complaints on clinicians. And today I have with me Dr. Tim Cookson, Dr. Sam King, and Mr. Adam Holloway, one of the lawyers from Wootton Kearney. So thank you all for coming again. Talking about home, the other issue with complaints often is the effect on family rather than just the doctor. It's the doctor's family that can also be really significantly affected. And I'm thinking of some cases that Adam and I might have done together where actually the family have been really affected. Often if there's a risk that the doctor's going to be named in the media, that's often a significant concern for family members. So I don't know if you guys have got any comments on how, or cases where the family have been affected.
I think the cases predominantly will be where a case is going to court or tribunal, and for that reason, invariably the lawyers will apply for name suppression. In terms of if doctors are going to be named in the media, Adam, is there something that can be done?
Look, it really depends on the situation, Sam, and in a way it's easier if there are proceedings ongoing because we have a forum we can go to make that argument, and it's not always an easy argument to make, but we can say, look, here are the reasons why in the context of this ongoing proceeding there should be an order that the doctor's name can't be put into the media. It's harder in cases where there isn't a coroner's inquest or there isn't an HPDT hearing that's ongoing. Generally speaking, the media is fortunately quite slow to use a doctor's name. But if how it will tend to come to people's attention is that a doctor might be contacted by a journalist to say, look, we're thinking about publishing a story and I want to seek your comment or give you the opportunity to comment on the story before it's published. If you get an approach like that, my advice would be just to call the MPS as quickly as you can, because it can be quite a time-bound thing to get back to a journalist. They can put some quite unreasonable deadlines on when they expect to hear from you. And it'd be very seldom that we give the advice to engage or to provide comment. But what we can do is engage with the journalist who's approached you to maximise the chance that they will make the wise decision not to use your name.
Thank you. That is useful. The thing that we often get from our members as a question when they're struggling with a complaint is that I just can't face seeing that patient again. And very frequently in those cases, we actually say, look, Right 10 of the Code of Rights is the right to complain. And you really can't ask a patient to leave your practice on the basis of a complaint alone. So I don't know, Tim, Sam, what do you reckon? Because that is advice we give all the time. But sometimes when the doctor's really struggling, they don't want to hear it. It's not what they want to hear.
I have had members where they are deeply stressed and they get anxious even if they see the patient's name or in the on the appointment book. Their heart's pounding, they're sweating and they can't see them. And in those situations, I think it's important that they don't see them. They cannot provide appropriate care in that situation. So it's not in the patient's best interests. It's certainly not in the doctor's best interests. So normally I would advise them that they should move to transfer the patient care to somebody else. It's really around the explanation of why you're doing that. If the doctor just thinks, actually, I just don't want to see them because of this complaint, I think that's different from actually this doctor's deeply stressed and can't see them.
And it depends a little bit on the nature of the complaint. So if it's about something that has happened, there's been an incident, and everyone acknowledges, yes, an error occurred, it's actually often not so bad in those situations. In fact, it's part maybe of the open disclosure process to actually be engaging with your patient and to talk about what's happened. That contrasts with the complaint that says, you are a horrible person, doctor, I hope your family burn in hell, etc., which is a personal attack. Now, I think fortunately in those situations, most of the patients who say that kind of thing, a complaint, will never try and see that doctor again. And if they do, they've clearly got some kind of personality issue that would need to be addressed. But I agree entirely with Sam that if the doctor concerned is so affected by the sight of that person's name on their appointment book, they're not going to be able to provide good care and do need to provide an assistance. And that's where working in a group is really valuable, because you can then say, well, look, we can continue to look after you. It just won't be me personally that does it.
And often that letter's good to come from the practice manager rather than the doctor themselves, do you think, in that situation? To say...
I would agree. I think that someone else needs to step in. And, for hospital doctors as well, fortunately for most hospital clinicians, there are other clinicians who can take over and ought to take over. So I think you're right. Someone needs to step in between the patient and the clinician, the clinician at the centre of the case.
But I think in the majority of cases, if the doctor can still see the patient who's complained and the patient wants to be seen, I think we would generally advise that they carry on seeing the patient, because of that risk that by not seeing them, you're basically taking away their right to complain, that you've actually said that they can't. There is a consequence to a complaint, and that is the withdrawal of your services, which obviously is against Right 10. So if we say that actually the doctor's going to carry on seeing this person, how should they handle that? Should they be doing double-length appointments and writing double-length notes? What should a doctor do if they're actually still seeing the patient who's made the complaint?
I actually think it's important when you begin to see the patient again after a complaint has taken place that you establish mutual trust. And I think, and that all that needs to say is sit down with the patient in a meeting, not in a consultation, and say, look, you were unhappy with my care and, I've responded to that. Does it feel resolved for you? Do you feel that you can trust me moving forward to be your provider? Because if a patient says, no, actually, I don't trust you, then I think it's important to move towards finding another doctor, because trust is the basis, isn't it, of the therapeutic relationship. So I think if you have the conversation, that's probably a good way forward, rather than knowing there's an elephant in the room but not identifying it.
Another strategy is often complaints because there's been a difference of understanding of what actually occurred within a consultation. And it's very easy for a patient and a doctor to have quite different views as to what occurred and what was said. And so in that situation, you may say to the patient, look, we did have a communication issue last time. I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So on that basis, I'm going to have someone sit in with us who can, witness the consultation, one of the nurses, so that neither of us will have that misunderstanding in future. And then the patient's got the option of either accepting that or saying, no, actually, I'm not comfortable with that kind of process. I'll find someone else to go and see.
And I think often if it's a complaint where there's actually been an error or something has gone wrong, I think often the doctor will feel that they will do their absolute best for that patient moving forward. I think most of us, if something's gone wrong for one of our patients that we've, at least in part had something to do with, we will try and make sure that every other part of their journey is as smooth and as gold standard as possible. So I think in some ways that patient is likely to get very good care from then on if that relationship continues as a good thing for both sides.
Or they may try and use that switch of power to try and achieve things for themselves that they're not entitled to.
Yeah, so then that's that really important, as you say, sit down and set some boundaries and some expectations of this is what I can do and this is how I'm going to do it, and are you all right with that? But I think that's a common issue with dealing with a complaint and the emotions involved in dealing with a complaint is how you actually then deal with that patient moving forward. I think it's really hard. And probably more so for GPs, I think, because they tend to be in that situation more. Okay, so one other aspect of this that I wanted to talk about was actually the problem with the slowness of the system. Often from the HDC, you get 3 or 4 weeks to respond, but sometimes your practice manager hasn't given you a letter from the HDC until a week or 2 have passed. You know, you're often fully booked with patients. It means you have to look through all the notes and work on the response. It's just another job to do at the weekend or on your evenings off. And then once you've sent the response in, sometimes you might not hear from the HDC for 2 years or even more sometimes, at which point it can feel like, you know, everything's suddenly woken up and someone new is looking at the case and they're asking a whole list of questions again, and it feels like it's just, you know, Groundhog Day and doing it again. So I'm not sure what the solution is for that, apart from us saying, look, you're not alone. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Because I do think the slowness of the system actually makes it worse. I think if it could actually be resolved quicker, it would be easier to deal with.
It's almost like death by 1,000 cuts, isn't it, when it's a slow process. But what I say to members now is, once you've sent it off to the HDC, try to put it out in the back of your mind. Don't think about it anymore because you're not going to hear from them for 2 years, so you don't need to think about it. And I know that it's easy for me to say that, right? But it's so hard to do. But that's what I tell them, to set their expectations that it's going to be a long wait. And I also reassure them that it doesn't mean you're more vulnerable. It's just because the HDC are very resource constrained. And so they're taking 2 years now.
Yeah, and it can look. Sometimes they do it in 6 months, you know. So it's not always 2 years, but it's not uncommon, is it?
Well, that's right, and I think the two things, as you say, Lucy, the really important thing is to make sure our members absolutely understand that it will take some time, and therefore to anticipate that rather than expecting anything else. So setting expectations. And the other is the point that you made, that just because it's taking a long time doesn't necessarily mean that the HDC is looking at it with a fine-tooth comb. It just means that they haven't got round to it yet. Previously, I think we would be able to say, well, look, if it's taking a long time, it's more likely to be investigation and therefore it will be more serious, but that no longer applies.
Yeah, no longer applies. Yeah, so unless the case is very straightforward, they will take 2 years because that's the workload that they've got to deal with. And I think if we normalise it that way, then the doctors kind of can get into that kind of routine. It was interesting, I had one the other day where the member emailed me because I'd given him that spiel, and he said, I'd just gotten used to the idea that I wasn't going to think about it anymore. And then I got an email from the HDC asking for more information, and I thought, that's not possible. But it was simply because the HDC hadn't noted his attachment with his response in it, and they were asking for a response. And but I think it gave the member a bit of a fright. But apart from that, 2 years.
I think the other problem with that whole delay in responses and delay in the process is the effect that has on the patients, because I think that the whole point of the complaints process is to try and resolve issues where patients have got concerns that you need to address. And I think if it sits on the HDC on a desk for a year, that's the patient's waiting too. And actually the patient hasn't got the answers they're seeking, may get more angry, may get more upset, and you're sometimes still having to see that patient during that time frame where something's gone wrong. It's in an investigation process, and if that process takes forever, yes, it's bad for the doctor, but it's actually also the patient is in the same situation, and then you've got the added complexity of that therapeutic relationship during that time.
I see on the HDC website now, there's a big thing right at the top advising patients or customers that there are long delays at the HDC, and please expect this to take a long time, and they apologise, but and that's the first time I've seen that on the HDC website. So they're finally.
But I have had complainants where they've waited so long for the HDC and got so frustrated they've then complained to the medical council while they're waiting. And it's and it just seems like not a great process, and so hard to have it, so hard to put it out of your head. So
it's hugely
hard
difficult.
to actually deal with it. It's not like you can move on, because you can't move on because it's still being processed.
I think one of the things I do encourage our members as well is that if it takes 2 years or 3 years to hear back from the HDC, you've worked clinically for that period of time. And so you've demonstrated good care and you've had, no more of the same error or whatever the situation is for that period of time. And that actually can be better in the long run, if that makes sense. So you can say to the HDC, well, since this happened, I've made all these changes, I've never had any issues or never repeated that mistake again. And so that is one advantage, if you like, of it in a difficult situation.
But the difficulty is, of course, that the vast majority of complaints that go to the HDC, the provider is not found to be in breach or even criticised. And so, that old saying that justice denied is justice deferred is justice denied. It is unfair. The waiting process is just unfair. And I think we all as individuals react badly when we're being treated unfairly.
Yeah, of course. And this is not to defend the delays, but we do know that the HDC are very resource constrained in the same way that we are. And they're doing the best they can. And they have made changes to try and reduce the wait times. I've noticed there's been a slight shift in the way they make decisions, which I think is really about trying to whittle those times down. So it's not like they're not doing anything, the HDC.
And they're certainly encouraging the use of the advocacy service as opposed to the
And the advocates, they're great. They're really good. Yeah, so it's hard for everybody. You're right. It's hard for us. It's hard for patients. And I'm sure it's not that easy at the HDC either.
And I do think that if clinicians are really struggling with the waiting, that actually talking to MPS or their indemnifier and just checking in and seeing, because I've definitely done that for members before where they've just been feeling so anxious that I've actually picked up the phone to the HDC and asked, where are we at? How can we help? Because I think if people are really struggling, we want to know, because maybe there is something that can be done.
I think it's easier if, when we've reviewed a case, we can reassure the member, actually, I think your vulnerability is low. It's where the vulnerability is significant, they're the ones that are much harder. And I think members know that they've done something wrong, then you can't escape that. And so until a case concludes, I expect it's very hard to keep it out of your mind.
But it's where you don't think you've done anything wrong, but the complaint is reasonably vitriolic or nasty, and you just can't help thinking, well, I just don't know how the HDC is going to decide this. I know Sam's reassured me that she's very unlikely to go anywhere, but how can she be sure? It's not the HDC. So there's always that nagging uncertainty.
Of course, that for we all manage these things differently, and. But there it is.
There it is.
But sometimes there are times when an early decision can actually be crucial for a doctor's career. And I think, Lucy, you managed to have some good discussions with the HDC about a process for that, didn't you?
I don't think we should ever promise that we'll be able to do that, though. But I think the HDC are aware of the problem and they are working on it. And if we can highlight a specific problem to them, then I think they will do their best for us.
Well, certainly I had a case where the doctor was applying for a position overseas and wouldn't be able to get it until the case was finalised at the HDC. It was one that had already been litigated and then the patient complainant had gone back again. There was nothing new. It really didn't need a lot of time at the HDC to make a decision. And yet his whole career progression was going to be stymied because of the delays. And so I wrote to the Commissioner and asked if this would be possible to put on the fast track list, and it was done within 3 weeks, I think, which was a great result.
That is a great result.
I think it would, and I think for special circumstances, I think if we ask for everyone to be put on the special track, I don't think it's going to work. No. But for special cases, I think they're not without compassion. I don't want to sound like I'm defending the HDC, but I am defending the HDC.
No, that's all right. Well, look, thanks very much for that. So I thought it's very important when we're talking about the issue of how our members deal with the impact of complaints on them and their families that we actually talk to a member who has had that lived experience, as we say these days. So one of our members, Dr. John, has been kind enough to talk to us. He resigned from his position as a physician in a regional hospital, in part because of the effects of an HDC complaint. And look, we're not going to talk about the specifics of his complaint, although some of our listeners may recognise the voice. And we're not going to name Dr. John. Now, I want to make it clear that this was our decision, not his. He's been very generous in agreeing to talk to us. We just wanted to ensure that we weren't breaching anyone's privacy or causing any more upset to those involved. So to briefly just give some general background, the case involved a family member complaining to the HDC about the care that had been provided to an elderly patient who had been admitted to hospital with significant polymorbidity and subsequently died. So just to start, John, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. So in your job as a physician, you must have encountered many family members who've been concerned when an elderly relative has been admitted with a terminal illness. And complaints in this situation aren't that uncommon. So what made this particular situation so hard?
Well, I had been practicing in New Zealand for some 10 years and had managed to avoid an HDC complaint. Yeah, and I had heard from other colleagues that it could be quite difficult and certainly not pleasant. In this case, the person filing the complaint was not the healthcare power of attorney and thus was never involved in any of the decision making. And in fact, I think that was at least part of the problem. She felt her voice had not been heard and in this fashion wanted to make it heard. Originally, the HDC didn't take up the complaint for that reason. But then seemingly once she hired a lawyer and they put together some 8-page complaint, the HDC apparently decided they had to respond. And the response was to ask me to justify care provided.
Yeah. And it is really hard. And I think, relatives who aren't involved are often actually a common source of complaints. And as you say, maybe it's because they want to feel involved and want to have their voice heard. And I think in this particular situation, there may have been some unrealistic expectations of what the public health system could offer and what was appropriate in this particular patient's case, which made it hard.
Well, the case involved a person with dementia. And, people have the right to refuse treatment. The way to extend that right is to put forth an advance directive. Here in the U.S., I think we're more comfortable with dealing with that. When I came to New Zealand, you literally were in the infancy of evolving into doing advance directives. And I don't think physicians have had much introduction to them. And from this case, the court system certainly doesn't understand it. So what was gutting to me about this was the patient himself lost all rights because this one daughter decided that she wanted him treated and made so much noise. Everybody was afraid and they just treated him. At the end of his life, when he clearly wouldn't have, it was extending his suffering. And I had to sit by and watch that because the courts intervened and said we had to treat him until they said otherwise.
Okay.
That, to me, was intolerable to sit by and watch that.
Mm.
There's a couple of things there in that scenario, Stan, that we do see as themes. One is that often there's actually a conflict within family members. So, the person who has the most, if you like, legal rights has one opinion, but it's someone who perhaps is less involved, and that often the driving force for that person it seems to be guilt, that they haven't been involved enough and therefore they feel bad about themselves and then they pass on that guilt. Were any of those factors present in your situation?
I would suggest if we give the person some consideration who made the complaint that yes, all that was involved and there had been a long history, but that, in fact, was why the person set up this advance directive and why he named his other daughter as his healthcare private attorney to essentially protect himself from this person. And again, what upset me most was that the system failed him totally. And for exactly what you were saying, many of my colleagues just said, look, it's easier to treat him than to take this woman on and have that battle. And I was like appalled.
So,
And in the end, I just said, if that's the case, I don't want to practice in this system any longer, because that was one of my core belief systems. And I lost confidence with any decisions I made after that, because it felt like I can't trust the system to protect me any longer.
So taking that point, when that complaint went to the HDC, what was your expectation of how that process would work?
Well, first, the letter came from them with this 8-page complaint, and they gave me 2 weeks to respond. Like, okay. So I assumed if they put a timeline of 2 weeks on me to respond, that there would be a timely response from them. But after that, it went months without hearing anything. In fact, the case dragged out for 2 years. So you have 2 years of wondering what is going to happen. And in the end, you get a letter that says, okay, we reviewed the case. We think the care was appropriate. Okay, you can go on about your way. No apology, no anything.
Yeah, so your expectation was that it was going to be faster based on the fact that they asked you to respond in 2 weeks.
That would have been my assumption. I would think a timely response for them would have been in 3 to 6 months at least.
Yeah, okay.
And did you get any indication from the HDC about the timeline?
None at all, essentially. I mean, they sent me a letter saying I had to respond. They sent me a letter that they had their response, and that was it.
Right.
And
as I recall.
Do you want to just expand a wee bit more on how that time, that length of time impacted on you?
Just imagine for 2 years, you've got this in the back of your mind that there's going to be some negative outcome to this complaint. Lost sleep. In the end, like I said, it led to me saying, look, I've had enough. I'm done.
Yeah. And how did that affect your family and the people around you?
Well, I'm single. My family or children grown up in the States, and so they, to be honest, probably didn't really know this was going on. So I was left to deal with it by myself. And as I said before, but for the support from you guys, I'm not sure how I would have dealt with it. It was nice to get your reassurance, because I checked in with you often, Lucy, to say, hey, can you tell me anything, what's going on? And it was your reassurance that kind of gave me some sense that it would be okay in the end.
So, Dr. John, how did you go? Did you manage to confide in colleagues? What sort of support did you get around you if you didn't have family?
I spoke to a couple of trusted colleagues, and in fact, one of them was also named in this complaint, and we would talk about it together. But as I said, as far as the DHB was concerned, I didn't feel like I got much support from them at all, and just didn't even bother after a few conversations with them.
Must have been a very isolating time for you.
Yes. As I said, it essentially led to me deciding it was probably just time to retire, as opposed to, this wasn't the first time I kind of had this battle with some of my colleagues, like, you are treating people in my opinion, inappropriately because family members are pushing you to, and they genuinely would just shrug their shoulders. And I'm like, well, again, I just decided it was time to end.
You mentioned earlier about seeing patients after this incident happened. How did it affect your decision making? Because as doctors, we make decisions all day, every day.
Yes, I've been in practice for some 20, 30 years. I do geriatrics and palliative care. I've been helping people at the end of their life make significantly difficult decisions, 99% of the time with good result. But this left me uncertain and loss of confidence, as people like to say. And then again, I felt like if this is the case, I really don't think I can practice effectively like I used to. So it's time to resign.
Did it affect, I mean, you talk about elderly patients who perhaps were towards the end of their lives and making those sorts of decisions. Did it affect other decisions, medical decisions that you were making for other patients, like younger patients?
As a geriatrician, the majority of almost 100% of my practice was elderly, frail, elderly. Not all of them coming to the end of their life, but again, to the question, I think the best way to say it is it really resulted in a significant loss of confidence of my own decision making and or the support for what I was doing.
In this case, it was obviously the family that was the issue. Did you find that your attitude to family of subsequent elderly patients changed in any way as a result of what had happened?
No, because in this case, it was one family member who clearly, looking back, was emotionally unhealthy. She had been estranged from the rest of the family for some number of years. In fact, I stayed in touch with some of the other family members who were quite apologetic to the behavior of their relative. In fact, in this case, one of the relatives I had actually worked with at the DHB, and she was appalled that this complaint had gone forward on behalf of her and her family. So, and with a lot of reflection, the woman had some unmet need, and she lashed out with this complaint. And at the end of the day, that's what it was.
Mm.
Coming back to the length of time it took, and this is obviously conjecture, but if the process had taken 2 or 3 months, it had been a quick one, you'd had a quick response, and your decisions were justified, would that have made a difference, do you think, to the impact it had on you?
I think it probably would have. I think would have felt exonerated. It would have been nice to hear from the HDC that they recognized the complaint a little bit more, that the complaint had no merit. I often, in getting ready for this, wondered, I've heard that they make physicians apologize formally to their families. Well, how about a person who files, what are the consequences to a person who files a complaint that has no basis? None whatsoever.
Because my next question was going to be, was the outcome fair and well balanced? But it's probably that you've kind of answered that. The outcome sounds like it was fair, because obviously from that point of view, the care you provided was appropriate, and that's what the HDC agreed. But maybe the balance is the problem. Is that because the impact on the clinician isn't necessarily acknowledged in that process?
As you suggested earlier, I came to New Zealand from the US, where I'd practiced for some 20 years. Here we have the legal system where lawyers potentially sue you over a negative outcome, but we also have the medical council, which is much seemingly like the HDC, and a person can file a complaint to the medical council. That happened once or twice with me here. Similar situation, a very emotionally unhinged family member who was just very unhappy, took it out with a complaint. But the medical council here got back to me within a few months. They looked at the facts. It didn't move forward whatsoever. End of story. That felt much better than this process of just dragging on and on and on. And then in the end, just a fairly, cursory, we found no fault, carry on.
Interesting, because we often think that I've never worked in the US, but we often think working there, the complaint system and the court system would be significantly more stressful, but that doesn't sound like that was your experience.
Well, I would say, I told this to many of my colleagues in New Zealand, because when I came there, they said the exact same thing. And I told back then, I said, you guys are just as afraid of your HDC and act exactly the same way as the physicians do in the US, ordering more tests, doing things that at times you realize you probably shouldn't do, but your filter of an HTC complaint, I would say, it has caused exactly the same problem.
So that drive towards defensive medicine has basically happened here just as much, from your experience.
Exactly. It is no different whatsoever than the U.S. system from that standpoint.
Yeah. If you had the opportunity to feed back to the HDC or to suggest changes, is there anything that you think could be improved or make things better, or for the complainants and for the clinicians involved?
I think they should recognize, that I go back to my career when I was getting a degree in epidemiology, and we were doing research design and surveys. And it's a very biased research because there are only two kinds of people that complete a survey: someone who's very happy or very unhappy. And a person who's going to complete a complaint is generally just very unhappy. Now, I get at times that may be well-founded, and the idea here is to deal with cases where there was medical misadventure and perhaps poor judgment. But in cases where the physician was practicing appropriate medicine, it doesn't feel right, at all. And I think perhaps, some acknowledgement of that, when in the end, maybe we understand this process was difficult. We understand it may have been emotionally challenging for you. We hope that this, some degree of acknowledgement of this process. But the HTC seemed very who oversees these guys? Where does their authority come from? And who keeps them in check if they get outside their lane, so to speak? For example, their initial letter to me, where they said they declined the complaint originally, the woman had said in a meeting that I was rude to her. And they came back with, well, perhaps the doctor should consider training in communication. I'd been practicing some 30 years at that time, dealing with very difficult patients, families, and situations, that I needed training in communication based on this one complaint from a person who was emotionally upset. It just was insulting.
Interesting. Well, I mean, the HDC obviously does have legislation behind them, and I would say that they do have to stay within the boundaries of what the legislation says. But it's interesting because I think what you're saying is almost the language of the letters, and the especially that outcome letter is actually something that didn't help you recover from the process.
Pretty much every physician in New Zealand that I came in contact with is terrified of the HTC.
And one of the
a complaint and having to deal with them, because of people's negative experiences.
And you mentioned the lane, the HDC's lane. One of the difficulties that we have is it's an incredibly broad lane. So it's actually quite hard for them to stray outside it because it is so broad.
Yes, you definitely have the sense they can do whatever they want to do and impose whatever penalty they feel like, and you, in the end, just have to take it. And in fact, it was you guys that suggested the DHB was, be very conciliatory, apologetic, in your response, whereas you guys were like, no, we think you should take a bit harder stance, and I appreciated that.
Okay.
But yeah, you very much feel powerless in that situation, and that you are beholden to whatever the outcome is.
It is interesting because obviously your case, you weren't found at fault, and obviously if a doctor is found at fault, the HDC do have a process which would go on to the practitioner's disciplinary tribunal. So there is a process where people can have an outcome, but it's interesting that you felt all that in a situation where actually there was never any fault found, and so that actually the fear of that is huge, even when there isn't a problem. And it is interesting that you say that many of your colleagues also had that fear, when in fact the HDC, the number of cases that actually go to discipline is really a very small fraction of the cases they look at. And so, yeah, it's interesting that they create that fear.
Yes.
The impact that this had on you is actually totally understandable. And I remember when I started, one of the senior colleagues who retired soon afterwards said to me, Tim, it's not the complaints where you've done something really wrong that really hurt. It's the one where you've really put in a big effort and you've gone beyond what you would normally do and you still get a complaint about it. And those are the ones that kick you in the guts.
That's exactly right. And that was the case here. I felt very strongly that this person, the patient himself, had been mistreated because of this family member's needs and her strong voice, and the medical system went along with it. And it, like I said, it got at my core value system of practice. And I guess when you asked what made it so hard, that was it. That this person had gone through pain and suffering that I thought could have been avoided had people stood up to this person. And they did not, because they were afraid that she would make a complaint, and indeed she did.
Well, John, thanks so much for sharing that with us. Look, I know it was a really hard time for you, and I really appreciate you coming back and actually talking to us about how it affected you and what your perceptions of the HTC and their process ended up being after being involved in a complaint. I really hope that life is good for you now and that you're enjoying your retirement, and wish you all the best with that. So thank you very much for joining us, John.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Our next podcast we're actually going to be talking about how we help colleagues, how we help ourselves when dealing with complaints. So maybe this will come up more in that one. But for today, thank you for listening to our podcast. I hope it's been helpful. Our podcasts do provide general information. And if you want advice on a specific case and you're our member, please do contact us on our advice line, which is 0800 2255 677 during business hours. We look forward to catching up with you in our next podcast. If you like the Medical Protection podcasts, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic, please email us on nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org. Thanks.